January 12, 1943. The mid-Pacific sky above Bougainville burned white with sunlight. The sea below shimmered like molten glass, dotted with the faint silhouettes of drifting warships. At 12,000 feet, a single F-6F Hellcat tore through the air, its engine coughing, oil smearing across the canopy. Inside, Lieutenant John "Red" Harrigan squinted through the blur, gauges failing, radio dead. Behind him, 6 Japanese Zeros fanned out, wings glittering like silver knives in the sun. They closed fast, disciplined and confident, veterans of a sky they once ruled. The Hellcat shuddered under bursts of gunfire. A tracer cut across the fuselage. He banked left, then right, nowhere to run. At that moment, instinct overrode fear. Harrigan pulled the stick hard, blind, desperate, trusting only motion and instinct. The Hellcat vanished into its own smoke. Seconds later, the sky erupted. 1 Zero spiraled down in flames, then another, the formation collapsing in confusion. From the deck of a destroyer below, sailors watched silver fragments fall from the clouds, like rain. By early 1943, the Pacific War had reached a brutal equilibrium, a struggle of attrition fought across endless ocean and scattered islands. For nearly 2 years, Japan's Imperial Navy had reigned supreme. Its Zero fighters, swift and agile, had carved legends in the sky. American and Allied pilots had learned to fear their precision and their invisibility. But the tide was shifting. The United States, its factories roaring at full capacity, was reshaping the air war. A new generation of aircraft emerged from the assembly lines, faster, sturdier, and far deadlier than the light, elegant Zeros they now faced. The F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, symbolized this transformation. Built not for grace, but for survival. It could dive faster, climb higher, and take punishment that would rip the wings off a Zero. Across the Pacific, airfields were carved out of jungles and coral reefs. Names like Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and Bougainville became synonymous with exhaustion and endurance. Fighters flew from dirt runways, their mechanics working through monsoon rain and oppressive heat. For every victory there was loss, a pilot gone missing, a name scratched off a mess hall roster, a flight that never returned. At the front, a new kind of warfare had taken hold. Tactical, improvisational, intimate. Pilots didn't just fight battles, they fought seconds. Every decision mattered. Every maneuver could mean life or death. In that crucible, instinct was as valuable as training. And instinct was something American aviators were learning fast. Among them was Lieutenant John "Red" Harrigan, a former civilian stunt pilot turned naval aviator. He'd learned to fly on barnstorming circuits across Texas long before the war. By 1943, he had more than 300 flight hours in the Pacific and a reputation for boldness, sometimes reckless, sometimes brilliant. To his squadron, VF-17, he was the man who could make an impossible turn seem planned. Their mission that January was simple on paper. Escort bombers striking Japanese supply positions near Bougainville. But in practice, nothing was simple in the Pacific. The weather changed by the minute. Cloud banks rolled in like curtains. Enemy radar was crude. But the Japanese pilots didn't need it. They hunted by sight and instinct, often appearing out of the sun, unseen, until it was too late. The Japanese 204th Air Group, operating from Rabaul, had launched interceptors to defend the island. Their Zeros were light, perfectly balanced, and deadly in skilled hands. But the pilots who flew them were not the same men who had ruled the skies in 1941. By 1943, Japan's training schools were depleted. Fuel shortages cut flight hours. The veterans who remained were stretched thin, exhausted, and increasingly cautious. The Americans, on the other hand, were now numerous, well-equipped, and learning from each engagement. Combat reports from the Solomon Islands revealed a shift. U.S. pilots were beginning to master the Zero's weaknesses. They avoided slow turns, fought in vertical climbs, and used their heavier planes as battering rams of air power. Harrigan's Hellcat Squadron was part of that evolution. Their aircraft, with thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 650 caliber machine guns, embodied a new philosophy. You don't need to dance with the enemy if you can outlast him. Yet, even the toughest planes couldn't escape fate. That morning, the mission began routinely. 4 Hellcats escorted a formation of dive bombers heading toward Japanese positions at Bouin, on Bougainville's southern tip. The sky was clear, visibility endless. Radio chatter was calm. Coordinates, wind direction, the hum of engines. Then, without warning, the bombers came under attack. Zeros dropped out of the clouds in perfect formation. Fast, silent, deadly. In seconds, chaos erupted. 2 bombers burst into flame. Another dove for the sea. Harrigan's flight broke to intercept. The formation scattered. In the confusion, his Hellcat took a burst through the cowling. Oil sprayed the windscreen. His instruments flickered. He was alone, flying blind in a sky filled with enemies he couldn't see. That was the beginning of the event that would later be studied in naval aviation schools for decades, the maneuver that turned instinct into legend. The battle for air. Control over Bougainville was part of a larger campaign, the Allied push toward Rabaul, Japan's most heavily fortified base in the South Pacific. Rabaul was a fortress, a volcano-ringed harbor bristling with anti-aircraft guns, supply depots, and airfields. Whoever controlled the skies above it would control the seas beneath it. For Japan, the defense of Rabaul was a matter of survival. Its air units, once elite, were now fighting a defensive war with shrinking resources. Fuel shortages forced pilots to ration flight hours. Replacement parts were scarce. Every Zero sent up had to return. There were no planes to spare. In contrast, the United States had abundance. By late 1943, Grumman's assembly lines were producing a Hellcat every hour. New pilots arrived monthly, trained in formation tactics and teamwork. Their planes carried radios, radar beacons, and better visibility, tools the Japanese could barely match. But even with superiority in machines and numbers, the Pacific sky remained unpredictable. Combat wasn't decided by statistics. It was decided by seconds of judgment. Japanese pilots still possessed unmatched skill in close combat. Their planes could outturn and outclimb most American fighters at low speed. In the hands of veterans, the A6M-0 was still lethal, a blade honed by years of mastery. This dynamic created a paradox. The Americans held the advantage in technology and endurance, yet the Japanese still ruled the immediate sky. Every mission became a study in adaptation and survival. The U.S. Navy's flight instructors began drilling their pilots in energy fighting, vertical dives, rolling climbs, and high-speed slashing attacks. Never turn with a Zero. Never let it on your tail. Use the dive. Use your weight. That became gospel. Still, no textbook could prepare a pilot for the chaos of a dogfight. In the heat of combat, theory dissolved into instinct. On the morning of January 12, 1943, Lieutenant Harrigan's flight departed from Henderson Field at dawn. The sun rose behind them, a thin red line cutting through low fog. Their objective? Protect a strike group targeting Japanese shipping lanes near the southern coast of Bougainville. The bombers flew steady, heavy with ordnance. The Hellcats circled above, watching for interceptors. Everything was routine until the radar warning. Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 215. They came fast. 12 Zeros, perfectly aligned, their formation glittering in the rising sun. The attack was sudden and coordinated. The Japanese leader, a veteran ace named Lieutenant Masaru Endo, executed a textbook 12 o'clock high intercept, diving directly into the bomber stream. Within seconds, The air became a storm of tracers and vapor trails. Two bombers were hit immediately. One fell burning into the jungle. Harrigan's section broke left to intercept the attackers. He caught one Zero broadside with a burst. The plane disintegrated, but the rest swarmed him. His wingman, Ensign Toller, tried to cover, but was hit and bailed out. Then the oil line on Harrigan's Hellcat ruptured. Oil streaked across the windscreen, blinding him. The cockpit filled with heat and the smell of smoke. The engine vibrated violently. He pulled up hard, trying to climb through the clouds. When he broke through, he was alone. And the Japanese formation had already begun circling below. They had spotted the wounded Hellcat. 6 Zeros rose toward him in a spiral. Coordinated, calm, deliberate. It was a trap they had performed countless times. The Hellcat was slower, heavier, damaged. In the clean blue air above Bougainville, John Harrigan should have been finished. Below him, the sea glimmered faintly. Ahead, clouds stretched in endless white layers. He could hear the faint rattle of his own engine. And nothing else. At that instant, Harrigan made the decision that would later define him. He didn't plan it, didn't calculate it. He simply acted. The blind turn was born not from doctrine, but from pure instinct, a maneuver no manual could explain, and few would have dared to try. That single moment would transform a desperate fight into one of the most remarkable encounters in Pacific air combat. A pilot's mind in the sky. Every combat pilot in the Pacific carried two battles, one against the enemy, and one within himself. For Lieutenant John Harrigan, both collided at 12,000 feet that morning. He wasn't a strategist or a hero seeking glory. He was a man reacting faster than fear could settle. Flying blind was every pilot's nightmare. Oil on the canopy, smoke in the lungs, horizon lost. Yet the very chaos that blinded him may have saved him. In the cockpit, stripped of sight, he reverted to touch and sound. He could feel the engine torque, the air pressure shifting through the stick. The faint whistle of airflow across his wings told him his position better than his gauges ever could. Instinct sharpened where logic failed. Behind him, the Japanese Zeros maneuvered like a pack of wolves, disciplined, deliberate, waiting for him to falter. Their formation was flawless, but in that perfection lay their weakness: predictability. Harrigan's turn, the one that would later be called blind, wasn't random. It was a gut calculation, rooted in hundreds of flight hours and an unspoken trust in his machine. He pulled hard into a roll, feeling the airframe groan, diving sharply before climbing into his own exhaust. In that blur of motion, he vanished from enemy sightlines. The Zeros overshot, their synchronized attack dissolving into confusion. That was the human paradox of air combat. The mind's calm amid chaos, and the instinct that defied reason. A split second of chaos, the blind turn, was later analyzed in tactical debriefs, and it confounded instructors. On paper, it should have been fatal. Executing a sudden hard roll and climb while blinded by oil risked a stall, or worse, structural failure. But Harrigan's maneuver broke a fundamental rule of dogfighting. And that's precisely why it worked. Japanese tactics relied on discipline and visual tracking. Their pilots attacked in pairs or trios, using coordinated movements to box in their prey. A damaged enemy that dove or banked predictably was an easy kill. But Harrigan's turn erased predictability. By diving, rolling, and climbing through his own smoke, he created a visual dead zone, a pocket of uncertainty that even skilled pursuers couldn't read. In that instant, the hunter became the confused. His Hellcat's heavy frame allowed a steep dive without tearing apart, something a Zero could not match. As the Zeros followed through the turn, their formation compressed. The leader lost visual, clipped his wingman, and both spiraled out of control. The remaining pilots, reacting instinctively, overcorrected. It was chaos. But a chaos born from one man's willingness to defy logic. The blind turn became a textbook case of asymmetry, using one's weakness, blindness, as a weapon against a structured opponent. Naval Air Command later cited it as an example of unintentional deception in aerial combat. The machine that survived. Its technology decided who lived and who fell in the Pacific skies. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest plane, but it was built like a fortress. Grumman engineers called it the Iron Works, because its planes came home when others didn't. The F-6F's power plant, a Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, could take brutal punishment. Even with a punctured oil line, it could run long enough to escape or fight. The aircraft's thick armor and self-sealing fuel tanks turned survivability into a tactical edge. The Japanese A6M-0, by contrast, was a masterpiece of engineering sacrifice. It was light, elegant, and deadly, but it had no armor, no self-sealing tanks, and paper-thin wings. It was designed for offense, not survival. What had made it invincible in 1941 now made it fragile by 1943. Harrigan's Hellcat absorbed damage that would have turned a Zero into a fireball. Even blinded, the machine responded faithfully. Its hydraulic controls, its robust airframe, its sheer mass, all gave Harrigan seconds others would never have had. That technological contrast mirrored the war itself. Japan's brilliance in precision meeting America's mastery of endurance. The blind turn wasn't just a maneuver. It was a collision between two engineering philosophies, each tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable: combat. The human, tactical, and technological threads intertwined in that moment. The man, the motion, and the machine. But there was more to this story than skill or design. The next layer belonged to the enemy. How 6 Japanese pilots, trained to perfection, suddenly found their world collapsing into confusion and disbelief. Precision meets chaos. From the Japanese formation's viewpoint, the encounter began perfectly. 6 Zeros had isolated a damaged Hellcat. A clean kill, textbook in every way. Their leader, Lieutenant Masaru Endo, was a veteran of China and the early Pacific campaigns, credited with more than 30 victories. He had fought over the Coral Sea, Wake, and Guadalcanal. He knew how American pilots thought: cautious, methodical, bound by procedure. He expected this one to behave the same. Through his gun sight, Endo saw the crippled Hellcat stagger in the air. Oil trailed behind it like a black ribbon. The kill should have taken seconds. He led the attack, signaling his wingmen to maintain spacing. The disciplined dance of Japanese air combat. But then, in a heartbeat, the target vanished. One moment the Hellcat was there. The next, it was gone, swallowed by its own smoke. The Zeros broke formation, each pilot banking to reacquire visual contact. Their radios crackled with short, clipped shouts. Endo pulled up, scanning the glare below. Then came a flash. Not from the ocean, but from above. A dark shape cut across the sun, diving fast. His brain registered what his eyes could barely believe. The same Hellcat, falling toward them from above. He rolled to evade, but his wingman hesitated, confused by the maneuver. They clipped wings, a fatal kiss of metal and air. Both planes disintegrated. The remaining Zeros, disoriented and suddenly leaderless, scattered. Their formation discipline, the heart of their advantage, collapsed in seconds. For the Japanese pilots who survived, it was a bewildering moment. They would later describe it as a ghost in the sky, an enemy that disappeared, then struck from nowhere. In the months that followed, Japanese after-action reports mentioned unusual diving tactics by American pilots near Bougainville. The blind turn had left an imprint, not just in losses, but in the erosion of certainty. Instinct beyond fear-air combat in the Pacific was as much psychological as mechanical. At closing speeds above 400 miles per hour, the difference between life and death was measured in reaction time, or courage. For Harrigan, that moment of blindness triggered a primal state. Survival instinct sharpened thought into something beyond logic. His mind stopped calculating angles or odds. He felt, through vibration, airflow, resistance, where the sky moved around him. Later, in debriefs, he would say only, "I turned because it felt wrong not to." That phrase puzzled analysts, but it captured the essence of aerial combat psychology. Pilots who survived long enough developed a second sense, an almost animal awareness of danger and opportunity. It wasn't luck. It was intuition trained by repetition, fatigue, and fear. For the Japanese pilots, psychology worked differently. They were trained to control emotion, to suppress instinct in favor of precision. That discipline made them deadly in formation but vulnerable when order broke down. When the Hellcat vanished, their mental framework cracked. Confusion spread faster than fire. Fear in combat is rarely admitted, but it lives beneath every decision. The moment discipline faltered, the illusion of invincibility, once the Zero's greatest weapon, dissolved. The thin line between luck and mastery after the battle. When Harrigan returned to base, the crew gathered around his battered Hellcat. Its wings were peppered with holes, oil still dripping from the cowling. One mechanic whispered, "No man flies through that." Harrigan said nothing. He climbed down, his face unreadable, his hands trembling. Later that night, as the squadron shared coffee in the operations tent, someone asked how he'd done it. He stared at the ground for a long moment before answering quietly, "I didn't think. I just turned." To the men listening, it sounded like humility. But to the historians and tacticians who studied the mission logs later, it raised a question that lingers over every account of heroism. Was it skill or luck? Air combat is a crucible of both. Skill gives you control. Luck gives you survival. Harrigan's blind turn became an emblem of that duality. The razor edge between mastery and accident. In classrooms years later, instructors replayed the maneuver on film strips and chalkboards. They diagrammed airflow, angles, vectors, but no equation could replicate what had happened. The truth is that no maneuver, however brilliant, exists in isolation. It arises from fear, instinct, training, and chance converging in one impossible instant. That's what makes it human, and why such moments echo long after the guns fall silent. That intersection, human instinct, enemy confusion, and the morality of chance, framed the stage for what followed. The most extraordinary 90 seconds of Lieutenant Harrigan's life, when the Pacific sky itself seemed to collapse in motion and flame. The Pacific sky over Bougainville, 0:09.47 hours. 6 zeros in tight pursuit formation. One damaged Hellcat ahead, trailing black smoke. At that altitude, sunlight turned everything silver. The sea, the wings, even the contrails. The air was thin, dry, and brutally bright. Lieutenant John Red Harrigan's cockpit was a furnace. Oil smeared across the canopy. Visibility was nearly zero. His breathing quickened inside the oxygen mask. The smell of burnt metal filled the air. The altimeter needle wavered. The engine shook as if ready to seize. Through the clouded glass, shadows flickered. The Zeros, closing in. He felt their presence more than he saw them. The hum of approaching engines, the faint glint of sunlight off aluminum, the Predators tightening the circle. Harrigan's left hand gripped the throttle. His right, slick with sweat, rested on the stick. He was at the edge of the combat zone, the point where fuel, altitude, and hope all ran out. He knew if he dove straight, they'd follow. If he climbed, they'd outturn him. Every rule of air combat said the same thing. Don't roll blind. But logic was useless now. The instruments were dead, the radio silent, the canopy opaque. Only instinct remained. He pushed the stick forward, a shallow dive, baiting them closer. The Zeros followed, spreading out into attack position. Their formation perfect as geometry. Then, with a violent pull, he snapped the Hellcat into a full roll. Blind, brutal, sudden. The G-force crushed him into the seat. His vision darkened at the edges. Oil sloshed across the canopy. His world turned black. He felt the wings groan under the strain, the metal shuddering, threatening to tear apart. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Only noise, vibration, and gravity's grip. Then the sound changed. He leveled out and realized he was no longer in front of them. He had inverted, then climbed through his own exhaust, emerging behind the formation. The Zeros were still tracking the space where he had been. Their synchronized turns collided, two wingmen clipping each other as they tried to adjust. The sky erupted in chaos. Harrigan saw the first Zero spin out, a blur of silver tumbling toward the sea. Instinct took over. He lined up a second target, squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns thundered in unison. A stream of fire tore through the Japanese plane's fuselage. It exploded mid-turn. He banked sharply, rolling away from debris, oil and smoke billowing behind him. The remaining 4 Zeros scattered, disoriented. The tight choreography that had defined Japanese air tactics dissolved into panic. They were reacting, not leading. Harrigan's Hellcat roared through the center of the melee. Wounded, but defiant. He caught a glimpse of 1 Zero trying to climb above him, the pilot desperate to regain altitude. He rolled, chased, fired again. Tracers stitched across the Zero's right wing. Flames erupted. The pilot bailed, his parachute blossoming against the sunlight. A white flower in a sky of fire. The fight had lasted less than 90 seconds. 6 planes had entered the engagement. When it was over, only 3 remained airborne, and none in control of the situation. The sudden silence that followed was almost surreal. The ocean stretched endlessly below, calm and indifferent. Harrigan looked around. Smoke, debris, drifting fabric from parachutes. His heart pounded against the harness. His breathing came in ragged gasps. He checked his instruments, still failing. The compass spun aimlessly. Fuel pressure low. Ammunition almost gone. He had survived the impossible, but he was now lost, alone, and barely airborne. Far below, sailors aboard the destroyer USS Meade watched the scene unfold through binoculars. They saw the Zeros spiral down, one after another, like pieces of silver rain falling into the sea. At first, they thought it was a bomber formation hit by flak. Only later would they realize it was a single pilot who had turned defeat into domination in less than 2 minutes. Above the waves, Harrigan steadied his breathing and turned toward where he believed home was. The Hellcat's engine coughed, sputtered, and held. He was flying on willpower and the stubborn endurance of a machine built to survive. Each mile home was a victory measured in seconds. He didn't think about glory or kills. He thought about land, about fuel, about staying conscious. The Pacific stretched forever, glittering like broken glass. Ahead, through the haze, a faint outline appeared. An island, small and dark. He set his course for it, unaware that this return would become as legendary as the fight itself. The Hellcat flew low, just a few hundred feet above the Pacific waves. Its right wing was perforated, smoke trailed from the cowling. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant John "Red" Harrigan gripped the controls like a man holding his own heartbeat in his hands. Every vibration felt like a countdown. He had roughly 15 minutes of fuel left. Maybe less. The compass spun, useless. The radio crackled with static. He was flying by dead reckoning, trusting only the sun's angle and his memory of the route home. Behind him, the ocean reflected a sky scarred by the wreckage of battle. Oil slicks, drifting debris, fragments of the fallen Zeros. It was a lonely, terrible beauty. Victory written in ruin. Harrigan's mind raced through the engagement he had just survived. 6 enemy fighters. A single blind turn. No rational calculation could explain it. He hadn't planned it. It had simply happened. Instinct and experience had fused into something beyond conscious thought. Later, engineers and tacticians would study the maneuver. They would realize it had exposed a critical weakness in the Mitsubishi A6M0, its fragility in high G maneuvers and its tendency to compress in dives. In theory, the Zero could outturn any Allied fighter. In practice, its light frame and lack of armor made it fatally unstable when pushed beyond design limits. The Hellcat, though slower in a horizontal turn, could endure tremendous structural stress. Its rugged frame absorbed punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. And that difference, invisible in a diagram, was what had saved him. Hadn't tu adher the fiend. Hellcat limped southward. The smell of burning oil filled the cockpit. Harrigan coughed, wiping his goggles. He thought about his squadron, the men he had left behind on patrol. They would be out there somewhere, maybe searching for him, maybe assuming the worst. He spotted land, a jagged strip of green and brown against the endless blue. It wasn't the base at Espiritu Santo. It was closer, one of the smaller islands used for emergency landings. He descended carefully, nursing the engine. The propeller made a rhythmic, uneven clatter, like a heartbeat skipping every third beat. Below, the coastline came into focus. A thin beach, a line of palm trees, and a strip of flattened earth used by patrol aircraft. He adjusted his flaps, sluggish but responsive. The landing gear groaned as it extended. He aimed for the center of the strip, knowing he had one chance. The touchdown was violent. The Hellcat bounced once, twice, then slammed down, tires bursting, skidding through sand and dust. When it finally stopped, silence rushed in. A silence so complete he could hear his own pulse in his ears. He sat there for a moment, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the horizon. The Pacific wind blew through the shattered canopy, carrying the smell of oil, salt, and burnt metal. Minutes later, a group of U.S. Marines came running from the tree line. They had seen the smoke and assumed another crash. What they found instead was a pilot, dazed but alive, and a plane that had survived what should have been annihilation. When they pulled him from the cockpit, Harrigan muttered only one phrase. "They were right behind me." Then they were gone. Within hours, word spread across the base. A single F-6F had taken down multiple Zeros in a one-sided engagement. Not through ambush or surprise, but through sheer maneuvering. It was a story so implausible that at first few believed it. The gun camera footage told the truth. 3 confirmed kills, 2 probable, 1 collision. The footage showed the impossible turn. The moment the Hellcat vanished from view, then reappeared behind its pursuers. Navy analysts studied the sequence frame by frame. They noted how the oil on the canopy had blocked visibility, yet how Harrigan's reaction had been instantaneous and exact. It was, they concluded, a maneuver executed without sight, dependent on pure spatial awareness. That report, circulated through carrier groups across the Pacific, would become training doctrine by mid-1943. Pilots were instructed to use the high G blind reversal, a tactic now nicknamed the Harrigan turn, as a last-ditch counter to Japanese tail pursuit. But inside the man who had done it, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. Harrigan sat by the edge of the airstrip that evening, staring at the wrecked Hellcat. Its blue-gray paint was blackened with soot. Bullet holes lined the fuselage like scars. He thought about the enemy pilots, men as skilled and devoted as himself, now gone. He had seen one parachute, none of the others. War had no celebration in it, only survival. That night, the Pacific wind was calm. The surf whispered against the coral shore. The stars above, the same stars the Japanese navigators had used, glittered coldly. And somewhere in the quiet darkness, the weight of what had happened began to settle. Not just for Harrigan, but for the entire war in the air. The myth of the invincible zero had cracked. The balance was shifting. The Pacific skies would never again belong solely to Japan. By dawn the next day, the wrecked Hellcat sat beneath a tarpaulin on the edge of the makeshift strip. Its wings were folded inward, riddled with holes. Engineers examined the damage in silence, noting the bullet trajectories, the stress fractures, the twisted propeller. They were looking not at wreckage, but at revelation. The analysis confirmed what few had dared to suggest openly. The Japanese Zero, the plane that had once ruled the Pacific, could be beaten not just by technology, but by endurance and physics. The Zero's glory had rested on its agility and climb rate, its unmatched turn radius. But it had achieved that at a cost. To make it light enough to dance through the sky, its designers had stripped away armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Every time a bullet struck home, the Zero bled fire. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the opposite philosophy: power and protection over elegance. It could not match the Zero in a slow turn, but it could dive faster, absorb punishment, and still bring its pilot home. It was the brawler to the Zero's fencer, slower to strike, but impossible to knock down. The intelligence division quickly moved. Photos and combat reports from Harrigan's gun camera were flown to Noumea, then to Pearl Harbor, and finally to Washington. By March 1943, Grumman engineers had already modified training manuals to emphasize vertical energy fighting, diving attacks, quick disengagements, and exploitation of the Hellcat's roll rate. The Harrigan turn itself entered unofficial vocabulary among Navy pilots. It wasn't a formal maneuver. No one could reliably replicate it, but it became a legend, a phrase whispered in ready rooms before missions. To new recruits, it meant one thing: never quit. Even blind, morale surged. For over a year, the Japanese Zero had been the haunting figure in every pilot's nightmares. They had called it the ghost plane, capable of appearing from nowhere and vanishing into the clouds. Now, for the first time, it had been outflown in a fair fight. Newspapers back home caught fragments of the story, stripped of classified details. Headlines spoke of a Navy pilot's daring escape and how one turn changed the battle for the Pacific. To the public, it was a story of courage and skill. To those in the cockpit, it was proof that survival was still possible. That even in the deadly arithmetic of air combat, human instinct could rewrite the odds. Within months, the change became visible in the air itself. American fighter groups pressed harder, diving aggressively into combat. Their losses dropped. Kill ratios climbed. In mid-1943, U.S. Navy pilots claimed a 13-to-1 kill ratio against the once-feared Zeros, an almost unthinkable reversal from the early months of the war. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, confusion grew. Reports filtered back to a bowl of zeros lost in strange circumstances. Sudden stalls, unexplained compressions during evasive turns. Veteran pilots began to suspect the truth. Their aircraft had reached its limits. No amount of bravery could overcome physics. In Tokyo, aircraft designers like Jiro Horikoshi, the creator of the Zero, were already working on replacements, the Raiden and Shiden Kai. But resources were dwindling, and the factories that once hummed with life now faced relentless American bombing. Innovation had come too late. At Henderson Field, Lieutenant John Harrigan recovered quietly. His right hand had been burned, his hearing partially dulled from the blast of his own guns. Doctors cleared him for flight 2 weeks later, but he never returned to combat. Command reassigned him to train new pilots, men half his age who listened as he explained the subtleties of survival, energy, and instinct. He rarely spoke of the day over Bougainville. When pressed, he would smile faintly and say, "I just turned the wrong way." And somehow it worked. But the men who flew after him carried that story into battle and into history. From that point on, every Hellcat pilot in the Pacific flew with a quiet confidence that the myth of the unbeatable Zero was over. As reports from Bougainville spread through Pacific Command, they arrived not as legend, but as data. Every surviving gun camera reel was copied and catalogued. Analysts paused each frame, tracing the arcs of tracers, the timing of role reversals, and the altitude differentials. In sterile film rooms under the hum of projectors, the human moment was reduced to numbers, angles, seconds, and G-forces. But even within that cold precision, something deeper was recognized. The engagement represented more than luck. It showed a shift in the psychology of air combat, the moment when American pilots began to believe that the tide could turn. At the Intelligence Division in Pearl Harbor, a classified report summarized it plainly. This action demonstrates not merely the superiority of the F-6F platform, but the increasing tactical discipline and adaptability of U.S. naval aviators under pressure. Those words, dry as they were, captured the quiet revolution taking place in the sky. From the Solomons to the Marshalls, the pattern repeated. Hellcat squadrons flew more confidently, no longer avoiding one-on-one duels with the Zero. Their new doctrine emphasized momentum over maneuver, using energy to dictate engagement range, then disengaging before the Zero could exploit its turning edge. The Pacific theater had entered a new phase, the age of technical warfare, where training, machines, and endurance outweighed the romantic myth of the lone ace. The Japanese High Command noticed. By late 1943, their pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Combat veterans, men who had once trained for years, were now teaching recruits who barely had 50 flight hours. The once fearsome squadrons of the Tainan Air Group, who had dominated the early war, were shadows of their former selves. Radio intercepts even recorded fragments of Japanese chatter, describing a new American trick, a maneuver, so abrupt that several Zeros broke apart mid-air trying to replicate it. Mechanics blamed faulty maintenance. Pilots whispered of cursed skies. In truth, the war had simply evolved faster than their aircraft could follow. By 1944, the American Hellcat had become the symbol of dominance, a mechanical predator designed to outlast, not out-twist. Its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, could take hits that would have destroyed any previous fighter. Its armor plating shielded pilots from shrapnel and gunfire. For the men who flew it, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was survival, made tangible. When Harrigan's story reached flight academies back home, it was retold with reverence. Young pilots memorized every movement, even if they could never truly reproduce it. To them, the blind turn became more than a maneuver. It became a lesson. That instinct, honed by discipline and desperation, could bridge the gap between human and machine. Newsreels simplified it, as they always did. Audiences in American theaters saw grainy clips of Hellcats roaring off carriers, accompanied by triumphant orchestral scores. The narration spoke of bravery, innovation, and divine fortune, never of exhaustion, fear, or the quiet cost that came after. Harrigan's name was rarely mentioned in those reels. His deed became collective property, a symbol rather than a story. And perhaps that was fitting. For every blind turn that succeeded, there were dozens that didn't. Pilots who vanished into the sea, unseen and unremembered. But for those who survived, Bougainville became a turning point in their understanding of the enemy. The Japanese were no longer invincible silhouettes in the sun. They were men bound by the same physics, the same fears. The mystique had lifted. By the end of 1943, American forces had captured a chain of islands stretching across the South Pacific. The advance toward Rabaul had begun in earnest. From there, the path to the Philippines, and eventually Tokyo, was already being traced on command maps. The air war had transformed from a struggle for survival into a systematic campaign of dominance. And yet, in all the reports, one line stood out. It was written by a flight instructor reviewing Harrigan's engagement for training purposes. He wrote, "This pilot turned blind, and the war turned with him." It was a poetic exaggeration, but also the truth in miniature. A single action, born of desperation, had become a symbol of transition. From fear to mastery, from chaos to control. In the vast scale of the Second World War, one pilot's maneuver might seem insignificant, a flicker against an ocean of fire. And yet, history often turns on such flickers. The blind turn over Bougainville was never officially named in the annals of command. No medal citation captured its terror, no public speech recounted its precision. But within the quiet fraternity of pilots who flew the Pacific, it endured, a whispered story of instinct, courage, and chance. It symbolized something the war itself was beginning to reveal: that technology and numbers could define outcomes, but only the human spirit defined survival. Machines evolved, tactics changed, and strategies were rewritten. Yet every great shift in warfare began with a single human decision, made in fear, in faith, or in the blind trust of one's own hands. For the Japanese pilots who perished that day, it was the moment their supremacy in the sky began to dissolve. For the Americans, it was proof that the myths of invincibility were just that, myths. And, for the historians who later pieced together the fragments, the gun camera reels, the technical reports, the diaries, it became a reminder that courage is often unrecorded until someone looks closely enough to see it. When John Harrigan retired years later, he refused every interview request. He lived quietly near the California coast, where the sound of waves still reminded him of the Pacific sky. Neighbors said he would often look upward at passing aircraft and fall silent, as if hearing echoes only he could understand. In the end, the blind turn was not a miracle, nor a myth. It was the meeting point of instinct and endurance. The instant when a man, blinded and hunted, trusted the invisible geometry of the air, and in doing so, changed the way a war was fought.